books this week. There were 9 new Batman titles that came out. I did not get Batman Scooby-Doo Mysteries. I kind of wish that I was getting that. I feel like that would just be a fluffy, fun read, but I didn't pick it up initially, so I'm still not getting it. And then also there was another issue of Pennyworth that I didn't pick up, but I got the rest of them, so we've got 7 Batman titles in here to take a look at. Let's see what I got. Alright, kicking things off with the non-continuity books, I picked up Harley Quinn, the animated series. This is issue number 6. I'm a couple issues behind on this one, but what I've read of this has been really, really solid. If you like the cartoon, you'll definitely enjoy the comic book. And then I also got Future State Gotham issue 10. This is another book that is kind of a little sleeper gem. I actually have been really enjoying this. The artist on this actually provided my least favorite artwork in Future State. But I feel like it lands a lot better in black and white for some reason. And I can't tell you exactly why that is, but I find myself really enjoying the art. It's actually had a pretty great, intriguing story written by Joshua Williamson, who is actually off the book now, but this second story arc has been decent. You're getting to see a lot of supporting Batman villains sort of in a new form now in the future states. We've got Hush in here, we've got a future version of the Joker, just a lot of interesting kind of fun concepts. This isn't a super heavy book, but it's enjoyable. And then to top it off at the end, you always get a Batman black and white story that usually has fantastic artwork on it. This issue, it looks like we've got none other than Sean Murphy working on it, so that's pretty cool. Alright, so that leaves us with 5 books that I'm going to be reviewing for you guys. 5 books in the Batman continuity. The second week of the month is always the big week where tons of stuff comes out, and it's usually not the best stuff, to be honest. First up, we've got I Am Batman number 6, the first issue of Jace Fox in New York. We've got probably my least favorite Batman title, Batgirls issue number 3. We've got The Joker issue number 12. This has got Giuseppe Camuncoli back on art again, which I was kind of surprised by. We had him just a couple issues ago, and then we were back on the Gilla March train, and now we're back to Camuncoli, so I don't know if this is who's going to be running this book moving forward, but I guess we'll see. Next, we've got the book that I wasn't super into when it started, but I have since come to really enjoy, and that's Batman Urban Legends. Hard to believe we're 12 issues into this already. And then last but certainly not least, because it's monthly right now, we are getting another dose of Detective Comics with issue 1052, probably the title I'm most excited to read this week. Alright, so I've had a chance to sit down and read through the 5 continuity Batman books this week. Sometimes I read them and review as I go. Sometimes I sit down and read them all. Today I read them all. And to be honest, theme of the day is very below par, which, second week of the month is always kind of the week where I'm like, ugh, I'm spending the most amount of money for the least amount of return in terms of enjoyment. Out of the 5 books in continuity this week, literally 3 of them, if I wasn't doing these videos, I probably would have dropped by now. And none of them really rose to the occasion this week, which kind of sucks. So I'm going to run through these fairly quickly. Fighting for bottom of the barrel this week, I'm going to go ahead and give Batgirls a rest and give I Am Batman the honors of bottom book of the week. Probably because this was the most disappointing. Kicking it off with the art, which I just kept getting flashes of other artists while I was reading this, and it wasn't like one artist specifically. Like, I got a lot of John Romita Jr., but then later in the book I got kind of a Scott McDaniel vibes almost. There were even a couple moments in here that were like faux Neil Adams almost. Just really inconsistent art in this, which did a lot to bring my enjoyment of this book down. But also, like, if you're going to put Batman in New York, what do you do with it, is really the big question. And for the most part, this book deals with, well, why are you bringing your Gotham City problems here? The mayor of New York doesn't like the fact that Batman's in town because he thinks he's going to bring all the crazies with him. And it just kind of begs the question of, why have superheroes if they only make the world worse? Which, when you're dealing with all fictional cities, you can kind of skirt that issue. But this, now that we've sort of like landed in the real world, and that's also the central focus of this book, it just kind of leaves me going, yeah, why does Batman exist? Like, Jace Fox should just go home and quit. Like, it didn't do anything to sell me on why this Batman should exist. Hoping with the next issue they can kind of pick things up a little bit. But I was really hoping for something a little bit stronger now that we're in a new arc. We've kind of solidified our creative team. We're out of Fear State. This should be Jace Fox's chance to shine, and it just isn't, unfortunately. All right, next up, never far from the bottom, is Batgirls issue number 3. Again, the art doesn't work for me. You've heard me talk about it a million times, so I'm not going to like dwell on it here. It's one of those where either it works for you or it doesn't, and for me, it doesn't. It hasn't changed. The reason that this book wins out over I Am Batman this week is that at least the art in this is consistent. Like, it is a vision of a singular artist that feels very cohesive and flows well within the context of itself. As opposed to with I Am Batman, where while I was reading it, I kept flipping to the back going, are there fill-in artists on this? Because it didn't feel like it was a singular artistic voice. As far as the plot goes for Batgirls issue 3, we're starting to juggle a lot. This is very Tinian style to me, where you introduce one thing and then another, and they're all going to kind of theoretically mesh together and, come to some grand conclusion. But for right now, it just feels like we're constantly chasing our tail. You've got the Seer, who is sort of the big promise that this book teased in the first issue, but then we switched gears at the beginning of issue 2 to focus on these magistrate peacekeeper wannabes. But then by the time we were done with the end of that issue, we found out that there was this other guy that was using fear toxin to brainwash people. And then now it's just become, a merry-go-round of these characters and the Batgirls bouncing back and forth to kind of handle all of them. There's a soap opera aspect to comics where it's like, you have your primary story, you have your B story, and you have your C story. And the editorial teams at DC used to be really good about focusing on the A story. There would be a supporting story that would just be a few pages, and then there'd always be a little seed planted for whatever that next upcoming series would be. And then eventually the B story becomes the A story concludes, and then the C story becomes the B story, rinse, repeat. They've kind of forgotten that. And a large part of that has been because of the trade paperback format and trying to write catering to a 5 or 6 issue story arc. Now it's like they're kind of trying to go back to that kind of episodic storytelling, but they're trying to tell equal amounts A, B, and C stories, and at least for me, it's not working. Okay, so then that leaves us with what would be my 3 favorite books of the week, but again, no books really hit it out of the park for me this week. Like, overall, set your expectations kind of low. My middle-of-the-road book this week goes to Joker number 12. It wasn't because Cameron Colley was back on art. I actually think that he's a pretty good choice for this book, and if he just took over consistently as opposed to being like a fill-in artist, I think I would be down with that. The only problem I had with him on art in this, and you can actually see it on the page I'm showing right here, is that a lot of the panels are just kind of a little empty. Now, that alone isn't enough to make this book a disappointment. The thing that made this book frustrating to me was the fact that this story felt like we were circling back to exactly where we were with issue 10. Because in issue 11, you had Jim Gordon, who was kind of out for the count. Barbara Gordon decides she's going to take over this investigation, and then it's all a fake out. Because in this book, Jim Gordon chases after her, Barbara Gordon is taken out, and Jim Gordon's back on the case at the end of it. And so it just felt like a giant waste of time. Now, obviously, Barbara Gordon will end up, playing into this story a little bit later on, but you didn't need an entire issue just to reintroduce her to the story. That could have happened within a couple pages. Like, Jim Gordon just could have called her and said, hey, why don't you come over here? And then she would have been there, like, no big deal. This mostly just felt like an unnecessary extension of the narrative. Now, the one thing I will give this book credit for is the ending. You find out who was behind A-Day, and there's some more revelations promised for issue 13 that I'm very curious to find out about. Interesting implications at the end of this book in terms of the greater DC universe, especially for Task Force Z. Now, of course, it's not a Joker book without the backup story featuring good old Punchline. We're finally at the point where the trial is about to begin. There's an attempt on Punchline's life, which is thwarted by Bluebird, and that's pretty much the majority of what you get in this. But all told, for just being a short 8-page story, it was very satisfying, and I am excited to see, finally, the trial of Alexis K. Alright, so then my runner-up book of the week goes to Batman Urban Legends number 12. There are 4 stories in here. You get the continuation of the Batman and Zatanna story, which is Bound to Our Will, in which Batman and Zatanna, throughout the course of like a illicit love affair they seem to have had, accidentally open a portal to another dimension, and once a year basically they have to suture the wound, more or less, through like a seance. This is just a weird Batman story because, as I said last month when this premiered, I just don't see Batman and Zatanna as an item. There is a John Constantine appearance at the end of this, so if you're a fan of him, this book might be worth a pickup for you. Although, he doesn't have much to do here. It's really going to boil down to what happens with part 3 of this story, of which this is 6 parts, so actually a pretty big storyline going on in here. My second favorite story in Urban Legends this week probably goes to White Witch in Stigma, which is written by Ram V and has art by Anand RK, which I really like the art in this, actually. Probably another example of love it or hate it, but I fall on the side of love it. There was a very interesting tease at the end of the last issue, which was that the White Witch, prior to becoming the White Witch, ran into Bruce Wayne and the Ghostmaker when they were out training to be vigilantes. We get to see a little bit of that interaction here. I was kind of underwhelmed with what we got out of it, but it was still cool to see it. The greater focus of the second part of the story was really on Simon Saint and basically how he went about creating the White Witch, and basically has executed her multiple times and then transferred her consciousness into other bodies, or at least that's kind of what I took away from it. So definitely interesting. This is a book that I would have liked to have seen more than 3 issues for. I don't know how they're really going to wrap this up, but at the end of the day, this is really just kind of like a one-shot. It actually might have worked better as a Batman Secret Files than as a backup story in Batman Urban Legends. Okay, so that brings us to the third story, which is Kid Eternity in Gotham. And frankly, I thought that this was stupid. The art in this is okay. I don't know, it has that computery, drawn on an iPad vibe to it that I really find distasteful. Maybe that's just the coloring and it's not the actual art. I honestly don't know. But ultimately, you have a murder mystery here. You have a murder mystery in which there are 3 characters, one of which is killed at the beginning of issue 1, and maybe there's one red herring in this, but Kid Eternity brings the victim's ghost back from the grave to find out who the killer is, and sure enough, it's the only other character we really know anything about in this story. So, this just feels pointless. Alright, so then wrapping up Urban Legends is Hounded, part 2 of 6. This is the story following Ace the Bat Hound, and this was easily my favorite story in Batman Urban Legends, and actually was my favorite story overall that I read this week. It wasn't quite enough to bring Urban Legends into the number 1 spot, because I thought that the stories in my number 1 issue were overall more consistent across the board. But this really was the standout for sure. You've got a Beethoven kind of story going on here, in which these criminals are basically, training these animals for evil. You find out that they had trained a dog for Lex Luthor and named it Lix Luthor, only to discover that Lex Luthor was allergic to dogs, and so the dog got sent back. But basically the story in this is Batman ends up in a tough situation. He can't get out of it. Meanwhile, Ace the Bat Hound finds a way to escape his kennel. He takes all of these superhero pets with him, and the promise at the end of the issue is that they're going to form their little Justice League of super animals that are going to break out and save the day. The writing on this was on point, the art was well done, and there were just some great little flourish moments. For example, Ace the Bat Hound with a chicken on his head, pecking out the combination to the bear's cage, which was just a cute little moment. All in all, just made for a really, really enjoyable read. Is it worth the price of admission? Maybe, if there's another story in here that strikes you. Okay, so then that leaves us with the number one choice. No big surprise, is going to go to Batman Detective Comics 1052. I was kind of hard on this book last week because I felt like the villain's plan was stupid. They haven't done anything to change my mind on that. But what I said last week was, the core conceit of the story can be contrived and silly. It depends on what you do with that story. We're now on day 19 of this Arkham Tower experiment, and I believe everything goes haywire on day 23 or possibly day 28. I actually can't remember now, but they make it very clear throughout the course of this issue that the main characters in this are losing control rapidly. Psycho Pirate loses his grip, and the only thing he can hope to do is make everyone forget. But ultimately, he's just, putting gasoline on the fire, because now the threads are getting pulled by the various characters. Batwoman, Chase Meridian, Huntress, Oracle. They're all more onto this plot than ever before, and you can really see the walls crumbling, and it's really ratcheting up the tension of the powder keg that is about to blow. So we're halfway through the Arkham Tower story arc, and while the last couple issues were a little bit up and down, the tension in this book is really starting to climb now with issue 6, and I am very much on board for issue 7. Now, of course, since it's Batman Detective Comics, that's not the only story in here. We do get chapter 6 of House of Gotham, which is the continuing story of this orphan that Bruce Wayne has sort of temporarily brought under his wing, but then released into the care of Leslie Tompkins, I'm pretty sure. But his continued bad decisions and bad encounters with various villains, including the Riddler, Clayface, Scarecrow, have all led him through a series of misadventures that has really warped his view on society and right and wrong. The big encounter he has in this is with Jason Todd, which creates an interesting tension because Jason Todd obviously is Robin, and Batman is using kids in his quest to fight crime, but the orphan notes that he is in trouble because he is a henchman for the Penguin, and the Penguin is doing the same thing, but society has deemed it okay for Batman to do this, but not for the Penguin to do it, and so he's stuck going back to Arkham Asylum, whereas Robin is, of course, ultimately comfortable at home in the mansion with Bruce Wayne. And at the end of it, you see the orphan just extremely embittered by the double standard that's going on there that is actually very subtly called out in this. Matthew Rosenberg doesn't hit you over the head with it. It happens kind of naturally throughout the story, and at the end you kind of realize what he's getting at, and you're like, oh, well done. Story well done. Out of everything that I read this week, my favorite stories probably would go to Punchline, Ace the Bat Hound in Hounded in Batman Urban Legends, and then finally Part 6 of The Tower in Detective Comics. So if you guys have had a chance to read any of these books, I hope you'll leave a comment down below. Let me know what you thought of them. I'd love to get the discussion going on what happened in This Week in Batman, and I hope you guys have a great week in comics. Thanks for watching, everyone.